This sort of if you lose one prime minister is careless, but you lose two is perhaps an indication that something bigger is wrong in French politics. And the problem has been, since Emmanuel Macron called a parliamentary election, a snap parliamentary election in June of last year, is that essentially nobody has a majority. The parliament split pretty much into three blocks: on the left, the centre and the right. Emmanuel Macron's party is in the centre. They've been trying to manage with a sort of a working minority situation, and it just hasn't worked, and that's why we're on a third prime minister. It comes down in each occasion to how the government is trying to pass a budget. At the moment, we were working on the budget for next year. The proposal from Francois Bayrou was a fiscal consolidation of 44 billion euros, so some tax rises, some spending cuts. The idea was to tackle something that he's been talking about for actually decades at this stage, which is trying to get France's ballooning debt under control. Something that's been exacerbated by a rise in bond yields globally has been the fact that the cost of servicing France's debt has gotten so much worse. He laid out the plan, first of all, in July. He left the summer open for negotiations. 2 weeks ago, he called a confidence vote, which is his right as a prime minister to do, but he didn't win a majority in Parliament. A majority of MPs voted against him, and so that means that he is now going to resign as prime minister. He's going to be going to the Elysee Palace to meet President Emmanuel Macron tomorrow morning to present his government's resignation, as is foreseen in the Constitution, and then it will be up to Emmanuel Macron to name the next prime minister, who will face the same fractured parliament, to see if perhaps somebody else might be able to do better and might be able to actually get an agreement on a budget.
Well, where does he turn? Who are the likely names? What actually could be named, or who could be named that would actually kind of unite some part of this parliament?
It's a great question, and it's not the first time we've had to play this game, and it's now at this stage turning into a bit of game of guess who, because we have people ruling themselves out on live TV. As I'm speaking to you, the head of the centre-right party, Les Républicains, said that he doesn't want to be prime minister, so that's one person we shouldn't expect to get the call from Emmanuel Macron. Really the focus, though, has been around whether or not Emmanuel Macron will look outside of his political grouping. He has chosen previous prime ministers from within his own party, from Francois Bayrou, who was from a similar centrist party that was allied with his, and then there was Michel Barnier before that, who had traditionally come from the centre-right party. So the focus really is whether or not he may pick from the centre-left, from the Socialist party. That would be what would change the parliamentary arithmetic in the National Assembly. That could win over more votes and make the possibility of passing a budget that little bit easier. Now, the Socialists are well aware of their position of power in this. They put forward an alternative budget ahead of this motion of confidence, which included some fiscal consolidation, about half of that of what was given in Francois Bayrou's proposal. So still the idea of cutting back on some spending, some new taxes, including on fortunes of over 100 million euros. They wanted to implement a wealth tax. Those are proposals that they say they're ready and willing to lead a government, but they want to do it on their terms. They want to put forward their budget, and they want to lead a government that's going to include the Socialists and the Green Party. So Emmanuel Macron has a choice. He could open that door to them, or he can go back to some of those from perhaps within his own movement, the likes of the current Defence Minister. Sébastien Lecornu is a name that's being mentioned quite a bit. We've also got the Justice Minister, Gérald Darmanin. He's said to be interested in the job as well. And a host of other names that will, people will want to put themselves forward for this role as well. But the question is whether anyone can do any better than the last 3, 5 or 7 prime ministers that we've seen under Emmanuel Macron's presidency.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be one of the big questions here. I want to dig in a little bit more to some of the proposals to try to answer that question, because you mentioned the wealth tax, of course. Bayrou, of course, had proposed 44 billion euro worth of spending cuts and tax hikes. He also floated the idea that maybe they would cut 2 public holidays as a way to reduce costs. I have to imagine that, too, was a very tough pill.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can imagine how that went down with the French public. By the way, there's a series of impromptu parties being held. They're being called leaving drinks for Francois Bayrou in various cities around France this evening. So there are hundreds of people gathered in different cities around the country celebrating the departure of the Prime Minister. So even in times of political crisis, the French will find a way to be French about it. And this is something that we can rely on looking at the idea. Indeed. In times of great uncertainty, there are things that you can rely on about political turmoil in this country. But, I mean, the question remains is that who could do something that's better or different. A lot of Francois Bayrou's proposals were about freezing things like income tax thresholds, freezing benefits payments at current levels. There wouldn't be automatic inflation-linked increases next year. That was to try and control it. He had wanted to front-load the fiscal consolidation, something that markets certainly that would be welcomed by markets, because we have seen this pressure on French borrowing costs as well. The Socialists, as I say, want to do it at a slower pace. This is, and Bloomberg Economics have highlighted this again recently, this is not a fiscal crisis right now. It is a political crisis. First of all, the current budget runs to the end of the year, so you've got still several months for somebody to try and cobble together a plan for what happens next year. If they don't get a budget agreed, we don't have a shutdown in this country. What happens instead is the current spending plans simply get mapped on to next year. Not anyone's ideal scenario, but not leading to a situation where there would be massive changes to either how services are provided to taxpayers in this country or how markets would be perceiving the situation down the line. But nonetheless, Francois Bayrou has repeated, and I think most market participants would agree, long term this problem does have to be addressed, and none of the remedies look particularly attractive. Cutting bank holidays was a particularly surprising idea, but Francois Bayrou, when he announced it, said, look, everything's open to negotiation. If you come up with a different plan, I'm willing to listen to it. None of the other political parties want to engage, though, with that sort of discussion.